I had a key to my boss's front door for 8 months before anyone at the office found out. By the time they did, half of them had already decided what it meant. A woman with a key to a powerful man's house, disappearing with him after work, coming in some mornings in yesterday's clothes. You don't need me to tell you what story that makes. They wrote it themselves. I just never corrected it. My name is Maya Chen. I'm 28. I worked in the marketing department of a logistics tech company, the kind of place where nobody outside the industry has heard of us, but everyone inside it knows exactly who Daniel Cole is. He built the company from a garage 20 years ago. He's the kind of CEO who remembers your name and your kid's name and somehow still makes you nervous every time he walks past your desk. For a year, people thought I was sleeping with him. I want to tell you right now, I wasn't. But I also want to tell you that I understand exactly why they thought it, because if I were on the outside looking in, I probably would have thought it too. The evidence, if you want to call it that, was right there. His car outside my apartment some mornings. Me, leaving the building with him at odd hours, both of us quiet, both of us tired in a way that had nothing to do with work. A key on my keyring that didn't belong to any apartment I'd ever lived in. What they didn't know is that most nights, I wasn't in his bed. I was in a hallway outside a locked bedroom door, listening for footsteps, waiting to see if tonight was going to be one of the bad nights. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from before any of that, because the reason I ended up there, the real reason, didn't begin with Daniel Cole at all. It began 4 years earlier, with my mother. My mom was 53 when she started forgetting things. Small things at first. Where she'd put her glasses. Whether she'd already told me a story. My dad and I laughed about it in the beginning, the way you laugh about things you don't understand yet, because laughing feels safer than being afraid. Then she got lost driving home from a grocery store she'd shopped at for 15 years, and nobody laughed anymore. Early onset Alzheimer's. The doctor said the words like he was reading them off a form, which maybe he was, because he'd probably said them 100 times before. I was in my second year of nursing school. I told myself I was lucky, I would know what to do. I would understand the disease better than most daughters would. I would be able to help. I want to tell you that knowledge helped. It didn't, not in the way I needed it to. Understanding a disease and living inside it with someone you love are two completely different things. I watched my mother disappear in pieces over 18 months. I dropped out of school to take care of her, because the two things, nursing classes and actually nursing my own mother, turned out to be impossible to do at the same time, and I chose her. I told myself that was the right choice. Some nights I still don't believe it. She died on a Tuesday in March, and I remember being angry that it was such an ordinary day for it to happen on. After that, I didn't go back to school. I couldn't be in a building that smelled like hospitals without my chest closing up. I took the first office job I could find that would pay my bills and my brother's tuition, because somebody in my family needed to keep a normal life going, and I told myself marketing was fine. It paid. It didn't ask anything of me that I couldn't give. That's who I was when I got hired at Daniel Cole's company 3 years ago. Just a coordinator. Junior enough that Daniel probably didn't know my name for the first year. I wrote copy for product launches. I sat in the back of meetings. I was good at my job, careful, on time, unremarkable in exactly the way that keeps you employed and invisible. Then, 8 months before any of this story really starts, everything changed on an ordinary Tuesday night, in a parking lot that had nothing to do with work at all. I was walking home from a late grocery run, a little after 2 in the morning, because I'd been up finishing a presentation and hadn't eaten. My apartment complex backs onto a small park, and that night I saw a woman standing near the swings in a bathrobe and one shoe, looking at her own hands like she didn't recognize them. I knew what I was looking at before I even walked over to her. You don't forget that look. The confusion that isn't quite fear yet, but is about to be. I'd seen it on my mother's face 100 times. I said. Are you okay? Do you know where you are? She looked at me and said, very calmly, I was looking for the kitchen. Then she started to cry, the way a child cries when they are lost in a store. And I understood that whatever building she'd wandered out of, she needed to get back to it before something worse happened to her out here alone. I got her name out of her eventually, Grace, and I got her to sit on a bench with me while I called the non-emergency police line, because I didn't know what else to do. While I was on hold, a car came tearing around the corner of the street, headlights sweeping the park, and a man got out so fast he left the driver's door open. It was Daniel Cole. My boss. Barefoot, in sweatpants, looking like he'd aged 10 years since the last time I'd seen him in a quarterly meeting wearing a suit that cost more than my rent. Grace? His voice cracked on her name. He crouched in front of her the way you crouch in front of a frightened animal, not a grown woman. Gracie, it's Danny. You're okay. I've got you. She looked at him and, for just a second, her whole face relaxed, like a held breath finally let go. Danny, she said. I couldn't find the kitchen. I know. I know, sweetheart. Let's go home. He got her into the car. Only then did he seem to actually see me standing there, and I watched something close over his face, not quite panic, but close to it. The look of a man realizing a door he thought was locked has swung wide open. You work for me, he said. It wasn't quite a question. Maya. Marketing. My voice came out steadier than I felt. I found her by the swings. She seemed disoriented. He nodded, jaw tight, and I understood before he said anything else that whatever I'd just seen wasn't something he wanted seen. Please, he said. Please don't say anything about this. To anyone. I could have asked why. I could have made it his problem to explain. Instead, I heard myself say the only thing that made sense to me in that moment, the only sentence that came out of some part of me that still belonged to the daughter I'd been 4 years earlier. Does she have Alzheimer's? His face did something complicated, surprise, then wariness. Then something almost like relief, that someone else in the world knew the shape of that word without him having to explain it. Early onset, he said quietly. She's 58. It's been about a year and a half. My mom had it, I said. I know what 2 a.m. looks like with this disease. We stood there in a parking lot at 2 in the morning, two strangers who worked in the same building and had never spoken more than 20 words to each other. Suddenly holding the same kind of grief in our hands. He didn't ask for my help that night. He just thanked me, got Grace home, and I walked back to my apartment and didn't sleep at all. 2 days later, he found me at my desk before anyone else had arrived. He looked like he hadn't slept since the parking lot either. The woman who's been staying with Grace at night quit on Sunday, he said, no preamble, like he'd rehearsed getting straight to the point because he didn't trust himself to dance around it. Family emergency, no notice. I have interviews lined up for a replacement, but it takes weeks to find someone I trust in my own house, and I can't. I have a board meeting in 3 days I can't reschedule. And I can't leave Grace alone at night, not after what happened. What are you asking me? I don't know exactly. He rubbed his face. I know this is insane. You're an employee. This isn't. I'm not trying to make this your job. But you knew what you were looking at in that park in about 4 seconds. And I've spent 18 months hiring people who take longer than that to recognize sundowning. I would pay you whatever you needed. Just until I find someone permanent. I should have said no. Every reasonable part of me knew I should say no, that walking back into a bedroom with someone slipping away from dementia was exactly the wound I'd spent 4 years avoiding. But I thought about my mother, about the year and a half where the hardest part wasn't the disease itself, but how alone we were inside it. How nobody outside our small apartment understood what 2 a.m. actually cost a person. And I thought about Daniel Cole's face in that parking lot, and the fact that somewhere in this enormous company, the most powerful man in the building was trying to hold his sister together with almost no help at all, in total secrecy, because he was afraid of what people would think. 1 week, I said. While you find someone permanent. That 1 week turned into 8 months. I know how this sounds. I knew it then, too, which is exactly why I never told anyone. Because if you take away the truth, if you just look at the facts from the outside, it looks exactly like what everyone eventually decided it was. The facts. I left work most days with Daniel Cole. Some nights I stayed at his house until morning. I had a key. I sometimes came into the office wearing the same clothes as the day before, because I hadn't gone home. Once, a coworker saw me buying a case of adult incontinence pads and puzzle books at the pharmacy, and I panicked and told her they were for my grandmother, and she gave me a look I still remember. Half pity, half something else I didn't want to name. Here's what actually happened on those nights, the part nobody at the office ever saw. I would arrive around 7, after Daniel had already gotten Grace through dinner. I'd sit with her while she watched an old game show she liked, one where she still remembered most of the answers even though she couldn't always remember what year it was. I'd help her get ready for bed. And then I'd wait, in a chair in the hallway outside her room or on the couch downstairs, for the hours between 11 and 3. Which were almost always the hardest, the hours when the disease seemed to loosen its grip on the daylight version of her, and let something more frightened and more lost take over. Sometimes she slept through peacefully. Other nights she'd wake up convinced it was 1994, convinced her husband, dead for 6 years, was waiting for her downstairs, convinced she needed to go find him right that second. On those nights I'd sit with her at the kitchen table and let her tell me about a man I never met, and I'd hold her hand. And eventually the fear in her eyes would soften into something closer to tiredness, and she'd let me walk her back to bed. Twice, she called me Ellie. The first time it happened, I didn't understand it. I just answered to it, because in the middle of the night, correcting someone with dementia about who you are rarely helps and often makes things worse. The second time, Daniel was standing in the doorway when it happened, and I watched his face change. Ellie was her daughter, he told me later, in the kitchen, both of us too tired to pretend we weren't exhausted. My niece. She died 9 years ago. Car accident. Grace was never quite the same after that, even before any of this started. I sometimes wonder if losing Ellie is part of why the disease found her so fast. Grief does something to a brain. I don't know if that's science, or just something I tell myself so it makes sense. I'm sorry, I said, because there wasn't anything better to say. You look a little like her, actually. Ellie. Something about the eyes. He almost laughed, but it came out sad instead. I think that's part of why Grace trusts you so quickly. I've watched her be suspicious of every single caregiver I've ever hired. She let you in the first night. I didn't tell him that I understood exactly what it was like to become, without meaning to, the person someone else's fading mind reaches for. My mother used to call me by her sister's name in her last few months. I used to answer to it too. That was the real reason I kept going back. Not the money, although the money mattered. Every dollar of it went straight into my brother's tuition account, and for the first time since I'd started supporting him. I wasn't drowning trying to do it. Not loyalty to Daniel, exactly, although I did come to respect him in a way I hadn't expected to, watching him hold a company together during the day and hold his sister together at night. And somehow never once let either version of himself bleed into the other in public. I kept going back because Grace, on her good nights, would grip my hand across the table and say, "You're a good girl. You know that," and something in me that had been closed since my mother's funeral would crack open just slightly, painfully, and let a little light in. I never told anyone at work. Not because Daniel swore me to secrecy, although he did, in a low urgent voice the first week, explaining that the company was 6 weeks from a merger vote that would determine everything. That a board still nervous about hereditary illness and executive stability could use even a whisper of "there's dementia in the Cole family" to tank a deal worth more money than I could really picture. I understood the business logic. But that wasn't really why I kept quiet. I kept quiet because it wasn't my secret to spend. Grace hadn't consented to strangers knowing the worst nights of her illness. Daniel hadn't consented to his company treating his sister's disease like gossip. And honestly, this part took me longer to admit to myself. Some selfish part of me didn't want to explain it either, because explaining it meant talking about my mother. And I had built a very careful, very quiet life specifically designed around never having to do that at work. So when people started noticing things, I let them believe whatever was easiest to believe. Which, it turns out, is always the worst possible thing. It started small, the way rumors always do. A comment here. A raised eyebrow there. "Didn't I see you get into Daniel's car last night?" one of the account managers asked me in the break room, trying to sound casual and failing completely. He offered me a ride. My car was in the shop. That part, at least, had actually been true once, which made the lie easier to tell the second and third time it wasn't. "Huh," she said, in the specific tone of someone who has already made up her mind and is only pretending to consider new information out of politeness. I could have laughed it off harder. I could have made a joke, diffused it. But every time someone brought it up, I felt the ground shift slightly under a much bigger secret. And my instinct was always to say as little as possible and get away from the conversation as fast as I could, which, I understand now, is exactly what a guilty person looks like doing. Rachel Voss noticed before almost anyone. Rachel and I had been circling each other professionally for about a year by then. We were both up for the same promotion, head of brand, a role that had opened when our old director left for a competitor. Rachel had been at the company 2 years longer than me. She'd built her whole identity around being the person who worked harder than everyone else, stayed later than everyone else, sacrificed more than everyone else for this job. I don't think that's a villain's origin story. I think it's just a person who wanted something badly and had convinced herself the only fair way to get it was to outsuffer everybody around her. So when I started getting pulled into strategy meetings with Daniel that Rachel wasn't invited to, meetings that, from the outside, looked like special treatment, but were actually just Daniel checking in on me during the day because he knew I hadn't slept much the night before, asking quietly, "You good? Rough night," in a tone that anyone watching would have read as intimate. Rachel's patience started to fray in a way I understood even while it scared me. "You've been very close to Daniel lately," she said to me one afternoon, in the tone people use when they are building a case rather than starting a conversation. "We work closely on the platform launch," I said. "Also technically true. Also not the whole truth. That's not what I mean, and you know it." She crossed her arms. "People are talking, Maya. About you leaving with him. About the car. About you looking like you haven't slept in a month, which, by the way, everyone has noticed. If something's going on, I'd rather hear it from you than the break room." "Nothing is going on." I looked her in the eye when I said it, because it was true. Nothing romantic was going on. I just couldn't say the rest of the sentence out loud. She studied me for a long moment, and I watched her decide not to believe me, the way you watch a door close from the other side of glass. "Okay," she said, in a voice that meant the opposite of okay. "Just be smart. This job takes people who play by the rules seriously. It doesn't reward people who find shortcuts." I wanted to grab her by the shoulders and tell her the truth right there in the hallway, that I hadn't slept because I'd spent the night sitting outside a locked door listening for footsteps. That the only shortcut I'd taken was the one that let me pay off part of my brother's spring semester. That if she knew what those nights actually looked like, she'd never in 1,000 years be jealous of them. Instead I said, "Understood," and went back to my desk, and let her keep believing whatever was easier to believe. That was the pattern for months. Small comments. Sideways looks. An invitation to a team happy hour that quietly stopped coming. Someone changed the seating chart at an all-hands meeting so I wasn't near Daniel's side of the room anymore, which felt less like an accident than anyone claimed it was. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself the merger would close, Daniel would hire a permanent overnight nurse, and my strange double life would end quietly with nobody ever needing to know the details. I was wrong about how it would end. I just didn't know it yet. The night everything nearly fell apart started like any other Thursday. Grace had been having a harder stretch that week, 3 sundowning episodes in 4 nights, worse than usual. The kind of stretch that sometimes happens before a plateau, and sometimes signals a decline, and there's no way to know which until you're on the other side of it. Daniel had a dinner with 2 board members that night, the kind of dinner you can't reschedule 6 days before a merger vote, and I told him to go, that I had it handled. I did not have it handled. Around midnight, Grace woke up convinced the house was on fire. There was no fire. But you cannot explain that to someone whose brain is telling her, with total conviction, that there is smoke in the hallway, and the harder I tried to calm her the more frightened she became. Until she was out of bed, and moving toward the stairs faster than I could get in front of her. "Grace, wait, let me go first." She didn't hear me, or couldn't process it fast enough, and on the 3rd step down her slipper caught the edge of the stair runner, and she pitched forward. I got a hand on her arm, and it wasn't enough to stop the fall completely, but it was enough to slow it, to turn what could have been a straight drop down a full staircase into a hard, frightening slide that left her on the landing, crying, with a gash above her eyebrow, and a wrist that swelled up within the hour. I called Daniel. He left the dinner without a word to anyone, and drove home so fast I genuinely don't know how he didn't crash. We got Grace to urgent care, not the hospital. Because a hospital visit for a woman with dementia and no public record of her condition raised exactly the kind of questions Daniel had spent 18 months avoiding. A sprained wrist, 6 stitches above her eyebrow, and a doctor who looked at both of us with a question in his eyes that neither of us answered. We got home around 4 in the morning. Daniel sat at the kitchen table with his head in his hands, and for the first time since I'd met him, I watched the composed, unreadable CEO version of him completely disappear. "I can't keep doing this," he said, Not to me exactly, more to the table. I'm going to get her killed trying to keep this quiet. I'm going to lose the merger, or I'm going to lose her, and some nights I think I'd rather lose the deal. You didn't get her hurt tonight, I said. I was here. This happens. This is the disease, not a mistake either of us made. He looked up at me, eyes red. You should go home. You have work in 4 hours. I've asked too much of you. Go to sleep, Daniel, I said, because somebody in that kitchen needed to be the calm one, and it clearly wasn't going to be him that night. I'll stay until she's settled. I did go into work 4 hours later, on maybe 90 minutes of sleep, with a healing scratch on my own forearm from where Grace had grabbed me on the stairs. And I looked, by every account, exactly like a woman who'd had a very bad night for reasons nobody could quite name. Rachel saw me in the hallway, and her expression didn't hide what she was thinking at all. That afternoon, I got called into a meeting about the platform launch timeline, a project I had led for almost a year, the biggest thing I'd ever owned at that company, and found out 30 seconds into it, that my role on the project had quietly been reduced. Someone else, someone with fewer late nights and a cleaner reputation, had been added as lead. Nobody said why out loud. Nobody had to. I understood exactly which whispered conversation had made this decision for me. I sat through the rest of that meeting with my hands folded very carefully in my lap, because it was the only way I could keep them from shaking. Afterward, I found Rachel at her desk. Did you say something to Marcus about me? I asked, keeping my voice as level as I could manage. She didn't even pretend to be surprised by the question. I told him what everyone already knows, Maya. That you've barely been present the last few months. That you look like you haven't slept in weeks. That the timing of your promotion track lines up a little too neatly with how close you are to Daniel. I didn't say anything cruel. I said what I see. You don't know what you're seeing. Then tell me, she said, and for 1 second there was something almost like an opening in her voice. An invitation to actually explain myself instead of just being angry at her for guessing wrong. Tell me what's actually going on, and I'll believe you. But you won't, and you never will, and at some point silence starts to look exactly like an answer. I didn't tell her. I couldn't. It wasn't only my secret, and even in that moment, humiliated and exhausted and furious, I still believed Grace's dignity mattered more than my reputation. So I said nothing, and Rachel walked away with her jaw set, absolutely certain she'd been right about me all along, and I went home that night, my own apartment. For once, and cried for the first time in 8 months, not for myself exactly, but for how tired I was of being the only person who knew the whole shape of what I was carrying. The merger vote dinner was 11 days later. It was supposed to be a formality, a celebratory gathering of board members, major investors, and senior staff the night before the final vote. The kind of event where champagne gets poured before the paperwork is even signed because everyone already knows how it's going to go. I almost didn't go. I told Daniel I'd rather sit that one out. I need you there, he said. You built half of what we are presenting tomorrow. Don't let anyone make you disappear from your own work. So I went, in the one good dress I owned, and I stood at the edge of a crowded ballroom holding a glass of wine I wasn't really drinking. Watching Daniel move through the room the way he always did at these things, warm, confident, completely unreadable to anyone who didn't know what was waiting for him at home. Rachel found me near the bar about an hour in. She'd had a couple of drinks by then, enough to loosen whatever restraint had kept her quiet the past 11 days. I have to say, she said, not quite slurring but close to it. You clean up well for a woman who's been sleeping her way onto every good project this year. The room around us didn't go silent, it was too loud. Too full of clinking glasses and investor small talk for that, but a small circle of people near enough to hear definitely turned. Rachel. My voice came out sharper than I meant it to. Not here. Why not here? She stepped closer, and I could see something under the anger now, something that looked almost like hurt. Everyone already knows, Maya. The car. The nights. The way he looks at you like you're the only person in a room full of investors. Just admit it. Admit you got where you are because you're sleeping with the boss. And stop making the rest of us feel crazy for noticing. I am not sleeping with Daniel. I said it loud enough this time that the small circle became a slightly larger one. Then what were you doing at his house until 4 in the morning 2 weeks ago? Rachel's voice climbed. Marcus told me you came in looking like you'd been hit by a truck the next day. What exactly am I supposed to think that is, if it isn't what it looks like? I felt the floor tilt slightly under me. The way it does right before you say something you can't take back, or right before you don't. In that half-second, I thought about Grace, asleep at home with a home health aide Daniel had finally, quietly hired the week before. A woman I'd helped train myself over 3 exhausting shifts. I thought about my mother, and the disease that had taken pieces of her a little at a time until there was almost nothing recognizable left except her eyes. I thought about how tired I was of protecting a story that wasn't mine at the cost of one that was. I didn't get the chance to decide, because Daniel was suddenly there, having crossed half the ballroom in the time it took Rachel to finish her sentence. Rachel, he said, and his voice was quiet but it carried, the way voices do when a room is already half listening. I think you should stop talking. With respect, Mr. Cole, Rachel said, chin up, clearly deciding this was her moment to be right in front of the one person who mattered most. I think the board deserves to know what's actually been going on before tomorrow's vote. If there's a conflict of interest between you and an employee, that's relevant too. There is no conflict of interest, Daniel said. There's just a secret I've been keeping, and it's mine, not hers, and I'm done letting her carry the cost of it. He looked around the small crowd that had gathered, 2 board members, a handful of senior staff, a reporter from a trade publication, who I would later learn, had been standing closer than any of us realized. He took a breath the way you take a breath before you jump into cold water. My sister has early onset Alzheimer's, he said. She's 58. She was diagnosed almost 2 years ago. She lives with me, and for the last 8 months, on the nights I couldn't be there myself, Maya has stayed with her. Not because I asked her to pretend to be something she isn't. Because 8 months ago she found my sister lost and frightened in a park at 2 in the morning, and instead of walking away, she helped me get her home safely, and then she kept helping. Night after night, for almost nothing except discretion and overtime pay. Because she understood, better than anyone I've ever hired, exactly what my sister needed. The ballroom had gone quiet in the way a room goes quiet when people realize they've been watching. Something they didn't understand at all. I asked her to keep it a secret, Daniel went on, because I was afraid of exactly this. I was afraid that if any of you knew there was a hereditary neurological illness in my family, you'd start wondering about my own judgment, my own stability. Whether I was fit to run this company through a merger this size. I let that fear turn Maya into a rumor instead of letting her be what she actually is, which is one of the most decent people I have ever worked with. That's on me. Not her. Nobody said anything for a moment. I could feel my own pulse in my ears. My mother had the same disease, I heard myself say, into the silence, because if Daniel was going to spend his secret, I wasn't going to make him spend it alone. I dropped out of nursing school to take care of her. She died 4 years ago. I know exactly what those nights look like, and I know exactly how alone you feel inside them, and when I found Grace in that park, I couldn't walk away and pretend I hadn't seen what I saw. So I didn't. That's the whole story. There was never anything else. Rachel had gone pale, her wine glass forgotten in her hand. I didn't know, she said quietly, mostly to me. Maya, I'm sorry. I should have asked you directly instead of deciding I already knew. You did ask me, once, I said, not unkindly, because I understood, standing there, that she genuinely hadn't been trying to hurt me for sport. I just wasn't able to answer. That part isn't your fault. One of the board members, an older woman named Patricia, who I'd only ever seen from across conference rooms, stepped forward and put a hand briefly on Daniel's arm. You should have told us months ago, she said. Not because it changes anything about tomorrow's vote. It doesn't. It changes how we would have supported you through it. That's the part I'm sorry about. The merger vote went through the next day, without incident. Without a single investor pulling out over a secret that turned out to matter far less than Daniel had spent 2 years being afraid it would. If anything, I heard later, several board members spoke about it as a reason for more confidence in him, not less. A leader who could hold something that hard together quietly, without letting it derail the company, was exactly the kind of leader they wanted running it through a merger. Rachel apologized to me properly a few days later, in private, without an audience to perform for. It wasn't a perfect apology, she still, understandably, felt strange about how long she'd been wrong, but it was honest, and I accepted it. Because I understood by then that being wrong about someone isn't the same thing as being cruel, even when it feels like it from the receiving end. My role on the platform launch was quietly restored. Marcus, to his credit, apologized too, though more awkwardly, the way men who've never had to publicly explain their assumptions tend to. I got the head of brand promotion 2 months later, not instead of Rachel, but alongside her. Daniel restructured the department to create a second senior role, and honestly, once the noise cleared, it became obvious we worked better as a team than as competitors. We are not close friends. We are something more useful than that, 2 people who respect each other's work and stopped assuming the worst about each other's private lives. Daniel hired a full-time overnight nurse for Grace, a woman named Rosalind who is, by every account, wonderful at her job and considerably better rested than I ever was doing it. I still visit on Sunday afternoons, not because anyone's paying me to anymore, but because Grace still lights up a little when I walk in, and some days she still calls me Ellie. And I've made my peace with that. It doesn't feel like a wound anymore. It feels like being needed by someone who has very little left to give but still, somehow, finds a way to give me that. I think about my mother a lot more now than I did before any of this happened, which surprised me. I expected caring for Grace to reopen a wound I'd spent years keeping closed. Instead, somewhere in those long nights at that kitchen table, holding a stranger's hand through her fear, I think I finally forgave myself for not being able to save my mother from a disease that was never mine to defeat in the first place. I couldn't have saved her by being a better nurse or a more patient daughter. Nobody could have. I know that now in a way I didn't 4 years ago. People at the office still occasionally bring up that period, half joking, in the careful way people joke about things they used to believe and are a little embarrassed by now. Remember when everyone thought you and Daniel were, and I just laugh and let them not finish the sentence, because by now most of them know the real story. And the ones who don't have usually heard enough of it secondhand to understand they got it wrong the first time. I don't tell this story because I want sympathy, and I don't tell it to make Rachel or anyone else look worse than they were. People believe the easiest explanation because the easiest explanation is usually the one right in front of them, and I understand that better than most because for 8 months, I let them. What I've learned, though, is this: the truth doesn't always need defending as urgently as you think it does. Sometimes it just needs the right moment, and the right person willing to say it out loud, even when saying it costs them something. I spent 8 months protecting a secret that wasn't mine at the price of a reputation that was, and I'd make almost every part of that same choice again, because some nights, sitting at a kitchen table holding someone's hand while they wait for the fear to pass, matter more than what people whisper about you in a break room the next morning. If you're carrying something right now that looks, from the outside, like something it isn't, if people have already decided the worst version of your story, without asking you a single real question, I understand exactly how lonely that is. I lived inside it for 8 months. But I promise you, the truth is patient. It will wait for the moment you're finally ready, or finally forced, to say it. And when it comes out, the people who matter will understand. The rest were never really worth explaining yourself to in the first place.